appreciate your testimony today, Secretary Chao. And I noticed that in your written testimony submitted for the record, as well as your oral testimony today, you failed to make any mention whatsoever as to public transportation. That's a glaring omission. Can you explain why you have not testified and not spoken on public transit? Is it not important?
It's not excluded, so...
But you didn't mention it, though.
I didn't mention highways too much either. So, but
Well,
your
you
point
did
is well
mention
taken.
highways, but you didn't mention
It's
transit.
whatever is the infrastructure needs of the local communities. And again, we leave that to we don't express a preference for one or the other. We leave it up to the local communities. But I take your comment to heart.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you
Yes.
agree that public transit is and should be a tool in the infrastructure toolbox?
Sure, if the local community wants it. It's up to them to prioritize.
Okay, and do you believe that public transit systems significantly improve economic vitality and opportunities for small businesses?
In urban areas where there's density and where there is enough traffic, yes.
And it allows or it enables these local communities to prosper and grow. Isn't that correct?
Well, sometimes they can't pay for the transit systems, and then it's a problem.
Well, the federal government has always seen that it is important in the local communities that they have support for public transit, and you agree with that, don't you?
No, I think it actually varies. Some administrations support it more so than others. And
so you don't think public transit is something that the federal government should invest in?
well, the federal government does invest in federal transit. There's something called the Federal Transit Administration.
But you don't think that it should going forward because you left it out of...
No, I didn't say that.
Well,
you're asking me to prefer transit over something else, and I'm saying this is a local decision.
I'm just asking you to recognize it in your comments to our committee, and you failed to do so. And I'm
I don't
asking you
understand
why.
that. I didn't mention other modes of transportation like aviation. I was criticized on that as well.
Well, do you think public transit is important?
In certain cities where there is enough volume and density to support it, it can be a viable alternative transportation system.
Well, what is the Trump transportation plan insofar as public transit is concerned? What is the plan?
Well, we have a budget for the Federal Transit Administration. What's the budget?
Is that the one
There's a
that's
Federal
being cut?
Transit Administration with a full budget, and
But
we
the
support
budget
all the transit programs there.
Budget is being cut by 19%, correct?
Well, that indicates that sometimes administrations don't fully agree with all the transit projects.
Well, you're pretty good at jumping around my questions.
No, I'm trying to be cooperative and answer.
Well, yeah, no, you're not. Let me ask you this question. The Trump infrastructure proposal would turn the funding formula on its head by requiring state and local governments to cough up 80% of the cost of infrastructure. Do you believe that it's realistic to believe that cash-strapped municipalities in rural America will be able to squeeze sufficient revenues from state and local taxpayers to pay the 80% share of the cost of infrastructure improvements?
Well, as I've mentioned, the 80-20 applies only to interstate projects. That's always been the case. The rest of the transportation systems in the country is 10% owned by the federal government, 90% owned by the states.
Well, you're not
and the
answering my
existing
question.
programs, the budget still stays. All the formula grants and the FAST Act, that all stays. Yes.
Madam, my question is, do you
Yes.
believe that state and local governments will be able to cough up 80% of the share of the cost of infrastructure improvements? You believe they
Well,
will
that
be
is
able to
the question
squeeze-
of pay-fors, and as I mentioned, we will
you
work
think-
with Congress on that.
Do you think state and local taxpayers can afford to be squeezed?
Well, federal money is not free. Federal money is taxpayers' money as well. It's federal monies is actually taxpayers' money coming from the states and localities. They come up to us, we send it back
I got one
to the
last
localities and to the local state governments with federal strings attached.
One
That's
last-
what federal dollars are.
One last question. In your
Yes,
written
of course.
testimony, you state that the guiding principle of the Trump infrastructure plan is the use of federal dollars as seed money to incentivize infrastructure investment by state and local governments. My question is, how does the Trump infrastructure plan propose to incentivize private sector investment in rural areas?
By the dint of the federal government getting involved in certain projects, they offer the imprimatur of the weight and gravitas of the United States government. And with that, that actually improves the quality of some of the projects. And more private investors are willing to enter because they think that there's been a seal of good housekeeping. And that's why, again, the federal government's entry or being involved in a transaction is helpful to helping the private sector enter.
Well,
The gentleman's time has expired. I thank the gentleman.
Question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd also like to remind the gentleman